He wouldn't let them win. He wouldn't let them take his humanity. With a roar that surprised even himself, Ethan surged forward, pushing through the pain. His hand closed around the BB gun, the cold metal a comforting weight in his grip. He swung it with all his might, the plastic smacking against Larry's skull with a satisfying thunk. The group paused, stunned, and Ethan took advantage of the momentary reprieve to scramble away, his legs shaky but moving. The gun felt like a lifeline, a tool of power in his trembling hand. He had to get out of here, had to escape the clutches of these monsters. He stumbled down the alley, the sound of their footsteps echoing behind him like the beat of a funeral march. The pain was excruciating as Larry's hand closed around his wrist, wrenching the gun free. "You think you can beat us?" he sneered, the question a declaration of war. The others closed in, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of rage. Ethan felt a cold, hard object press against his groin and realized with horror that it was the muzzle of the BB gun. The shot was a white-hot bolt of agony, the BB lodging in his flesh. He crumpled to the ground, the world swimming around him. Through the haze of pain, he heard the sound of the gun being recocked, the metallic click of promise of mortar. They took turns, each shot a new level of hell, each one driving him deeper into the abyss. The laughter grew fainter, the world darker, until all that was left was the pain and the cold embrace of the asphalt beneath him. As they left him there, broken and bleeding, Ethan knew that this was his new reality. He had been claimed by the night, a sacrifice to the dark gods of Willow Creek. The candy in his pumpkin was forgotten, the sweetness of innocence lost forever. Halloween had become a night of horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He lay there, his pirate costume torn and stained with blood, his body a road map of their brutality. The pain from his bruised and swollen genitals was a constant reminder of the price he had paid for trying to fit in. Each breath was a battle, a fight against the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. With a trembling hand, Ethan reached down to touch the wound. His fingertips came away sticky with blood, the coldness of the metal BB a stark contrast to the warmth of his lifeblood. He could feel it, embedded deep, a twisted memento of the night's events. The pain was a living thing, pulsing with every beat of his heart, a constant companion in the quiet alley. He managed to push himself into a sitting position, his head spinning. The world was a blur of shadows and pain, but he had to move. He had to get away from here, from them. The cobblestones bit into his palms as he stumbled to his feet, the agony in his groin a sharp counterpoint to the throbbing in his head. The sound of their laughter grew fainter as he staggered away, the weight of his shattered dreams a leaden burden. The alley was a prison of his own making, the walls closing in around him. He had to find a way out, had to find a way to survive. The night air was cold, but Ethan barely felt it. His body was numb, his mind racing with a million thoughts that all led to one conclusion: he was alone. The gun was gone, the power it had briefly lent him now just a memory. He was just a boy, a pirate without a ship, adrift in a sea of fear. The blood trickled down his thigh, a crimson river that painted the alley with his pain. Each step was a battle, a war between the need to escape and the agony that threatened to overwhelm him. He stumbled, his legs giving out, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let them win, couldn't let them take his dignity along with his innocence. Finally, the alley opened up into a street, the light from a distant street lamp a beacon of hope. He hobbled towards it, his vision swimming. The sirens had stopped, the partygoers had dispersed, leaving only the echoes of the night's horror behind. The candy in his pumpkin clinked against the plastic, a mocking reminder of the fun he had once sought. As he emerged into the light, he saw the first signs of life, a group of teenagers dressed as zombies, staggering along the sidewalk. They stared at him with a mix of shock and revulsion, their makeup suddenly seeming all too real. He tried to call out, but his voice was a raspy whisper, lost to the wind. They approached cautiously, their eyes widening at the sight of his blood-soaked costume. One of them, a girl with fake blood smeared across her face, reached out a trembling hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Ethan looked at her, his eyes glassy with pain, and realized that he didn't know how to answer. Was he okay? Would he ever be okay again? He took a deep breath, the cold air searing his lungs. "Help me," he managed to croak, the words barely audible. The zombies looked at each other, their costumes a stark contrast to the very real horror that stood before them. They didn't know him, didn't owe him anything, but in that moment, they were the only people in the world that mattered. They helped him to their car, the girl's gentle touch a stark contrast to the brutal hands that had just moments ago been tearing him apart. The warmth of the car's interior was a stark contrast to the chilling alley, and Ethan felt a small spark of hope flicker to life. They drove him to the nearest hospital, the girl's voice soothing and calm as she talked to him, trying to keep him conscious. The world outside the car was a blur of lights and shadows, each bump in the road sending a fresh wave of pain through his body. As they pulled into the emergency bay, the doors of the car flew open, and suddenly there was a flurry of activity around him. Nurses and doctors rushed over, their faces a blur of white masks and scrubs. He heard the girl explaining what had happened, her voice shaking, and he felt a surge of gratitude for her kindness. But even as they lifted him onto the gurney, the fear didn't leave him. He knew that the night wasn't over, that the demons of Willow Creek were still out there, waiting for him. And then, as the hospital doors slammed shut behind him, the world went dark. Ethan awoke to the cold, antiseptic smell of a hospital room. His head was pounding, and his body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. He tried to sit up, but a hand pressed firmly on his chest, holding him in place. "Easy there, kid," a gruff voice said. He looked up to see a burly man with a thick mustache, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and anger. "You're lucky to be alive." The door to the room burst open, and Deshawn's dad stormed in, his eyes wild with rage. "You little snitch," he spat, the words echoing in Ethan's pounding head. The room spun as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Before he could react, a hand shot out, slapping the girl who had been helping him so tenderly. "You got no right to mess with my boy," the man roared, his fist clenched tightly around a gun. The world went still, the air thick with the promise of violence. The girl stumbled back, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with shock. Ethan's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be happening. It was all a terrible nightmare, a trick of the mind. But the cold metal pressed against his forehead was all too real. A gunshot rang out, a deafening crack that seemed to shatter the very fabric of reality. Ethan felt a sharp pain, a white-hot burst of agony that consumed him. His vision blurred, and the room grew distant, as if he were watching the scene unfold from far away. He could see the horror etched on the faces of the zombie-costumed teenagers, their expressions frozen in a tableau of shock. And then, darkness. The pain receded, replaced by a cold, empty void. He was falling, tumbling into a bottomless pit of nothingness. He reached out, desperately searching for something, anything to hold onto, but his fingers found only air. The screams and shouts of the hospital staff were muffled, as if they were coming from underwater. He landed with a thud, the impact jolting him back to reality. He was on the floor of the hospital room, his body limp, his vision swimming. The lights above him grew dimmer, the edges of his sight shrinking into a pinprick of black. He could feel the warmth of his own blood pooling beneath him, the sticky wetness spreading across the cold tile. The doctor's frantic voice was a distant murmur, his words a jumble of panic. Ethan's hand fluttered up to his forehead, the cold metal of the gun still there, the source of his pain. The room was spinning, the lights above him now a blur of color. His breath grew shallow, each inhale a battle, each exhale a victory snatched from the jaws of the grave. The door burst open again, and a flurry of activity enveloped him. The doctor's voice grew more urgent, his hands pressing down on Ethan's chest with a force that seemed to drive the air from his lungs. The pain in his head grew, a crescendo of agony that threatened to consume him. He could feel the life draining from his body, his thoughts slipping away like sand through an hourglass. And then, silence. The room stilled, the chaos of moments ago replaced by a deafening quiet. Ethan looked up to see the doctor's face, his eyes filled with a sadness that spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words barely reaching Ethan's ears. "We did everything we could." The room grew colder, the light fading to a soft, comforting glow. The pain receded, leaving behind a numbness that spread through him like a gentle embrace. He could see the faces of Mike and Jake, smiling at him from the doorway, their girlfriends forgotten. They beckoned to him, their eyes filled with a warmth that seemed to chase away the shadows. With a final, shuddering breath, Ethan let go. He felt himself rising, floating above the room, the pain and fear of the night falling away like a discarded costume. He reached out to his friends, their hands meeting his, and together they stepped into the light. The world of Willow Creek was left behind, a fading memory of a night that had stolen everything from him. But as the light grew brighter, he heard a whisper, a faint echo of a voice that wasn't quite his own. "Remember me," it said, the words tinged with a sadness that cut through the warmth. And with that, Ethan was gone, leaving behind only the empty shell of a boy who had once dreamed of a perfect Halloween.